I hope that by the time I come to the stage of perhaps playing the role you've just played, we will be already out of the European Union. I would prefer not to use this microphone if that's acceptable to you. But on the absurd proposition that if you can't hear me, please say so, then I will use it. Now, there's a great deal I could talk about this afternoon, and I've decided to divide what I do want to say into 4 separate parts. And I'll deal with the first 2 before we break and take questions before the break. And then afterwards, I'll talk about fraud and corruption and immigration. But I'm going to start with an overview. When the sun never set on the British Empire, it was run by about 2,000 civil servants. The European Union employs, either as staff or advisors, over 100,000 people. That figure was seriously underestimated until Jens Peter Bonde, who's a Danish MEP, and I persisted in raising questions about the secret committees of the European Union. And we finally got a list of all 3,000, and by deduction we were able to calculate the number of people involved and the number of staff also involved, and that was what took us up to a figure of about 100,000. Now, I just want to talk about the reality of what we are stuck with in Europe at the moment. And I'm going to talk about things which mostly are not discussed and not widely understood, and they should be. The European Union is about control. It is not about enabling things to happen. Some months ago, there was a debate, so-called, in the chamber at Strasbourg. And as you probably know, you get 1 minute if you're lucky. And after that 1 minute, this microphone is switched off, and even if you're still speaking, nobody hears a word. And you only have that 1 minute. You can't intervene when someone else is saying something. You can't intervene after you've spoken because somebody else has said something you want to challenge. It is an elaborate charade, a talking shop. And as a result, very few members turn up for any particular debate. And that was the case on this occasion, and it was a debate, would you believe, about enterprise. Now, I have a background in international business. So I asked for 1 minute, and I got it. And there were about 20 other members in this chamber for over 800. So I was talking to empty chairs mostly. And there was the commissioner responsible for enterprise, a man called Verheugen from Germany. About more later if you want to ask about metrication, by the way. And Verheugen spoke for some 20 minutes, and it was perfectly clear from what he said that he hadn't the first idea of what enterprise, in the sense of wealth creation, is actually all about. There were then a series of other speakers, some of whom had the luxury of 2 minutes, who spoke about social matters, about what is known as the social market, because that's a favourite phrase of the continental Europeans. And most of the speakers were from the socialists, the communists, the Greens and the Liberals. And I think one member of the EPP, not a Tory from the UK, spoke before I did. By the time it came to my turn, I threw away what I was planning to say, because I'd listened to this cataract of platitudinous social nonsense for long enough. And I said this, more or less as I'm going to say it to you. How many people in this chamber today have ever had an idea for a new business, funded it at their own risk by borrowing or raising the money themselves and providing the security for it, expanded it to the point where they can employ other people and run it successfully for 20 years? How many of you have ever done that? You're way ahead of me. Not a single hand went up. And when Mr. Verhoeven came to the end of the wind-up of this debate, he made some remarks which were truly breathtaking in their arrogance and indifference. He didn't refer to me directly, but it was aimed at me. And what he in effect was saying, it doesn't matter whether you know about running business, we're here to manage the market of the European Union. That's what mattered to him. Now we come to the argument or the claim that the European Union is about diversity. And in one sense, of course, it is. It includes, what, nearly 600 million people from 27 different countries speaking at least 27, if not more, languages, each country of which, and even bits of those countries, have their own traditions and culture and way of doing things. And this is regarded as a coming together of diversity. And you will hear talk of diversity being a virtue. The reality is entirely the reverse. The reality is that everything is about standardization. And we've seen it with metrication, we've seen it with virtually every aspect of our daily lives that you care to look at. It doesn't matter what it is, the objective is standardization. And the classic example, of course, again, is metrication. What is the purpose of forcing metrication on this country if it isn't to standardize the European Union? There can't be another purpose. They talk about a free trade area. They talk about a common market. Do you remember that rubbish we got in 1975? It is a customs union. It is not a free trade area, and there is a crucial difference between the two. Ask any Australian wine producer and they will tell you instantly what the difference is. The French have freedom to send us as much wine, champagne, whatever, that they want. The Australians have to get quotas to allow their goods to be shipped into this customs union. They have to pay the VAT in advance before it comes in full. They have to account for the sales. They have to prove that the quantities that they've been allocated were actually shipped in and have now been sold inside the European Union. And on and on and on it goes. It is a laborious, tedious, expensive, wasteful process. And it is intended to be just that. It is intended to protect the markets of the countries that are already here in the European Union. That is its purpose. So when I learnt from some very good friends of mine who are wine producers in Australia, and as you will already have worked out, I've got involved in all this. When I found out that the Australian wine producers as a whole had overtaken the French in shipping wine to this country, not the European Union as a whole, and the French were actually losing market share, I have to admit I had a quiet cheer and we celebrated appropriately. Now I want to come to another aspect which is not widely understood. And my good friend Christopher Booker came up with the best description of it a long while ago when he talked about the hollowing out of our government and departmental processes. And what I mean by that is this. You will, most of you, remember the days when farmers received subsidies, deficiency payments they were called, and it encouraged them to produce enough food to feed this nation in the areas where that was possible. Obviously not bananas and the like, but where we could produce, we did. It also has to be said that this country has the finest wet grassland anywhere in Western Europe, perfect for the production of meat from cattle and sheep. But what has happened? We have a common agricultural policy which has been damaging our agriculture for years, to the point now where set-aside accounts for an area the size of the West Midlands. After foot and mouth some years ago, it became apparent that the European Union was positively against the cattle and sheep industries being fully restored in this country. They have a policy that agriculture belongs in Eastern Europe, and therefore the British should be discouraged by all means possible from producing their own food. Now, if you looked at what was the Ministry of Agriculture today, now called the EFRA, you will not find anybody in that government department with any first-hand knowledge of agricultural subsidies. They've all gone. So even if tomorrow we were out of the European Union, we would be starting again in terms of acquiring the skills and experience to be able to manage and support British farmers. And that's without the fact that thousands of farmers have given up altogether. It's been hollowed out. The same is true of the Board of Trade. We do not have a seat at the World Trade Organization's meetings. We are represented by, God help us, Peter Mandelson, speaking on behalf of all 27 member states. There is nobody in what was the Board of Trade, now the Department of Trade and Industry, so-called. There is nobody there who has any direct experience of negotiating trade deals for this country at a world level. They've gone. We've been hollowed out. The Civil Aviation Authority is the last one I'll mention. I could go on all afternoon about this, but I mention it specifically because one of my constituents was involved. I got a call from a small company near Heathrow Airport some time ago now, a couple of years maybe. And this managing director was beside himself with worry. His company produces specialist in-flight communication systems for the private jet industry. Now you may think that amounts to a handful of small planes that fly off on exotic holidays with wealthy businessmen. Not true. The private jet market is huge, and it's worldwide. And what happens is that let's say a royal family, a Sultan of Brunei, whoever, they will buy a Boeing and they'll buy it as a frame. And the inside is then fitted to their requirements. And the communication system in that Boeing would be provided by a company like the one I'm talking about. And they had just been told that they were having their airworthiness certificate revoked. Just like that. They've been in business for 30 odd years, maybe longer. They employed a large number of staff. They had, he told me then, and I have no doubt he was right, probably the best collection of specialist engineers, designers, airframe installers anywhere in the country, if not in Western Europe. They were a highly specialized, skilled business. And as he said, I've got 60, 70 families depending on me every month, to say nothing of the mortgages and the kids and the whole 9 yards. And what had happened was this. The European Aviation Safety Agency had just come into being in Cologne, and it had taken over the responsibilities of the Civil Aviation Authority in London, as indeed it had taken over the same responsibilities in every other member state. And it had instantaneously decided that all airworthiness certificates, other than those granted to the main builders of airplanes, would be revoked. Just quite arbitrarily and without any thought of the consequences. Now, you can imagine the reaction of this company and probably many others in the UK. I said to him, are you prepared to drop everything and go to Cologne? Yes, he said. I said, right, we're on the next plane tomorrow morning. And that's what we did. He and I got on a plane to Cologne, and we went to this European Aviation Safety Agency. And we sat at the front desk, we banged on the door, and we went in and we demanded to see the chief executive now. And this is the one time when being an MEP is actually quite handy, because they don't say no. They can't say no. Anyway, we got to see him about an hour later, and there was a great team of his staff. There wasn't an Englishman amongst them. The chief exec was a German who didn't speak very good English, so we had an interpreter. He started by boasting that he'd never been to England, which wasn't a very successful way of endearing himself to us. And we explained what had happened, and we demanded an explanation. And furthermore, I told him that we needed an explanation within the next 24 hours, and we were going to wait for it. And I reserved my position on whether I went public until he had an opportunity to sort this mess out. And he pleaded that he didn't understand, he didn't realise, nobody told him in London what the consequences would be, you know, always it's the other guy's fault. Anyway, to cut a very long story short, we got the decision revoked.
Well done. Well done.
It didn't take them long. Christopher Booker ran a piece about it a week or so later, and that company is still in business today, I'm happy to say. But the point really is this hollowing out. The Civil Aviation Authority had lost its powers to make decisions of that kind. The Civil Aviation Authority at one time was regarded as a world leader in terms of the way it managed civil aviation in this country. They were held up as an example, because we have probably more, in fact Heathrow on its own is the biggest international hub in the world. It has more international flights coming in and going out than any other airport anywhere. So to have the organisation which was supposed to be responsible for the overall safety systems and the security and so on, suddenly losing its powers and having them handed over to some obscure organisation in Cologne, who clearly hadn't the faintest idea about the consequences of what they were doing, is quite totally unacceptable in my book. Right, so that's enough for starters. Let me now go on briefly to the secret committees, which I mentioned earlier. 3,000 of them. We don't know who sits on them, except that no MEPs, nobody elected to the Parliament has a seat on any of these secret committees. They are all nominated officials, experts, consultants, you name it. They come from the academic world, from the government, civil servants, from around the European Union, and so on. But we, as elected members of the Parliament, are not allowed to sit on these committees. We don't know what their agendas are. We don't know what their budgets are. We don't know when they meet or how often. We don't know what their decisions are. And most importantly of all, we cannot get rid of them. They are there entirely to advise the Commission on what next it should do in terms of introducing new legislation. In other words, it is well, I think the word ratchet has been used before. It's a sort of vernacular railway. It's only going in one direction. Now let me come briefly to the question of money. You all know we give them £1.5 million an hour, in return for which we have something like 170,000 pages of legislation, every page of which we could do perfectly well without before we joined. And it's difficult to see an answer, and I've never ever been able to get one on either side of the English Channel to the question, what are the benefits of this? We all know the sort of generalities that are used, like isolation, influence, which is, I have to be polite here, cobblers. But let me come to the money. Did you know that there are 662 bank accounts in the name of the European Union in 45 countries around the world? Did you know that of those accounts there are some 30,000 subsidiary, what are known as pre-financing or imprest accounts, into which money is put to pay for projects that have been approved? And of course, once the money goes into an imprest account, they lose control of it because the new signatories on that account are the people who are handling the project. And that's where some of the corruption kicks in, which I'll talk about later. Only 1% of those accounts have ever been fully audited. And they have been audited by the Court of Auditors, which is itself an institution of the European Union. It claims to be independent, but it isn't. Each member state nominates a member for the Court of Auditors. Some of them are accountants, some of them are academics. I think a couple of them have some experience of the business world. One of them I know is a journalist, and they have no professional integrity as financial auditors as such. And I'll just give you a couple of illustrations of the consequences of that inadequacy. I'm advised by Christopher Arkell, amongst several others, and some of you may know that Christopher is one of the UK's leading forensic accountants. And he's a brilliant accountant, and he's also a very, very sharp cookie. He's passionately on our side in terms of believing we should not be part of this lunatic asylum, and he has been an enormous value to me in getting to grips with what is actually being done with your money. And one of the things he discovered was that the pension funds for the European Commission were appearing on both sides of the balance sheet simultaneously. They were being shown as a liability to the member states, but they were also being shown as an asset of the European Union, together with the money which the member states had already paid towards those pensions, because it comes out of the bigger pot of our general contribution. So in other words, there was double counting going on. And it amounted to some £300 million when we discovered it, or he did. I would never have discovered it in a month of Sundays, but he did. So I asked an innocent question. Is this a liability or is it an asset? Why does it appear in effect twice on one side of the balance sheet and only once on the other? Well, there was a lot of mumbling and technical jargon coming from the accounts department and the chief accountant in particular, a man called Gray, who is an Englishman, and grey by nature as well. And I have to tell you, and I can't explain the logic, Christopher might be able to, just take my word for it. This year, suddenly, in the 2005 accounts, sorry, 2006 accounts, suddenly the pension balance on the pension allocations on the balance sheet have been changed. Now, okay, it's only a small point, maybe it won't affect any of us, but it's a reflection of how they will, if they can, get away with anything. And we caught them at it, and they've now regularized the position. Let me give you another illustration of what we have to endure. Coming back to these imprest accounts. Let's suppose there's a project in, for argument's sake, Hungary, and it involves 200 million euros on an infrastructure scheme, bridges, roads, whatever. If that money is not properly spent and not properly accounted for, or some of it goes missing, you would expect the auditors to come down on it like a ton of bricks. And you would expect them to go to, for example, what is known as OLAF, which is the organisation responsible for investigating alleged fraud. And OLAF, in all the time it's existed, has never ever successfully brought a prosecution and recovered the money on any single case it's investigated. Not one. But the point of this story is this. After 5 years of investigation, that lost money or unaccounted for money is written off automatically. It's just regarded as gone. There is no further attempt made to account for it or recover it or to pursue the people who appear to have been involved in its mismanagement. It is automatically written off. And that's our money we're talking about. Something else that Christopher Arkell discovered, and that is that the opening and closing balances in the years 04 and 05 were never reconciled. Now, I better explain that. In 05, the European Union boasted, you may recall, that it was introducing a new system of automatic computer-based accounting based on double entry bookkeeping. 2005. I might incidentally just add that double entry bookkeeping was invented 1500 years ago by an Italian monk. But eventually the EU caught up in 2005. But it meant that the books had to be closed and all the closing balances reconciled at the end of 04 and then transferred to become the opening balances for 05. And we got some very compromised claims that such balances had in fact been reconciled. And superficially, the numbers appeared to make sense. Back to Christopher Arkell, here are the sets of numbers. He ran an analysis, and would you believe they did not actually reconcile at all. And I've been on this with his help ever since the 05 accounts came into the public domain. And we finally got them to admit, only in March of this year, over a year later, they have now finally admitted that the opening balances for 05 were never reconciled with the previous year. Now, what that also means is that there can never be an approval of future accounts. Because if you don't know where you're starting from, how can you possibly say what the position is today? It's impossible. So the Court of Auditors is now stuck with the problem, and this is why they didn't want to admit it. They're now stuck with the problem that they will never be able to sign off the EU's accounts as being a true and correct record, because the opening figures are in dispute. People ask me sometimes, why does the EU not carry out cost-benefit analyses? Wouldn't that be more sensible? Good question. So I asked it. Several times I asked it. And I kept getting all kinds of obscure, it's too difficult, very complicated, and so on and so on. And eventually, one of their minions finally came up with the unanswerable answer. And I tell you exactly, these were the words. We can't do a cost-benefit analysis on any of the things we introduce or decide should become law, what called law in the EU. We can't do a cost-benefit analysis because the benefits will be different in each country. And furthermore, the costs of enforcement might be different in each country. So it's quite impossible. Oh, it's a superb answer. They must have spent weeks figuring that out. And
Months.
well, okay. Now let me come back to this business about, well, an extension of what I'm just saying. The European Union uses a device which it calls shared management. Now again, it's probably not a phrase many of you have heard before, but you should have known. It should be widely known. But it's one of these obscure things which gets ignored by and large. And it's really an extension of what I've just been saying about cost-benefit. The view is that we, the EU Commission, decide what the law shall be, but you, the member states, are responsible for enforcing it. And that's your problem. We don't want to know about that. We don't want to know if it's inconvenient or costly or damages people's lives. No, we're just providing the law. You have the responsibility for enforcement. And that is what is laughingly described as shared management. We decide, you suffer the consequences. And it is appalling. I've had a case, some of you will know of Idris Francis, who's a very good friend of mine, and apart from being a passionate campaigner for our cause, is also a veteran car nut. And he's got a half a dozen beautiful old cars which he restores himself. Now, the particular kind of paint required to restore a vintage car is cellulose based, I'm told. And suddenly last year, the EU introduced legislation banning the use of cellulose in paint, without regard for the consequences for this highly specialised market, which tends to be particularly British. You don't find vintage cars in many other European countries, but you do here. I have been on for over a year on his behalf asking questions about how it is the vintage car market in this country has been damaged and without any regard for its interests, and let alone the vintage car owners. We're also talking about the specialist paint shops that employ people, and they have mortgages and lifestyles and kids at school and all the rest. We come back to what I was saying earlier about aircraft communication systems. Same situation exactly. These small companies have been put out of business simply to standardize the market. And then we come to a whole raft of mischief. Greek farmers claim subsidies or common agricultural payments on more land than there is in Greece. The total number of acres, sorry, hectares as they call them, claimed for Greek production of olives and tobacco is greater than the landmass of Greece itself. And of course, under shared management, does the Greek government care? Do they go out and have an army of investigators checking? Of course they don't. It's in the interests of Greek farmers. So they let them get away with it. And who's paying? We are. Italian butter. Oh, what a scam that was. And it's possibly still going on. The EU said, if you export butter from one EU member state to another, we will give you a special subsidy. Now the Italians took this to heart. They started producing butter with engine oil, cedar oil, any oil they could get hold of that looked vaguely or could be made to look vaguely like butter. There were no checks on the content, quality or edibility, to say nothing of health and safety, and they shipped this butter all over the European Union. This was before enlargement, so we're talking about Spain, Scandinavia, Austria, Germany, whatever. And once it went across the border, they then claimed the subsidy. Now, it was such an outrageous scam, and the quality of the butter was so dreadful that it wasn't long before the whole thing came to light. But to this day, nobody has been charged. Olaf has not recovered a single euro's worth of the money that was paid out in subsidies to these Italians. There has not been any prosecution, and the whole thing has been in effect now, years later, swept under the carpet because it is too embarrassing. And I raised this in my early days in Brussels. I sit on what is known as the Budget Control Committee, and we are particularly charged with ensuring the proper use of public money, quite right too. And I raised this, and I got a big yawn from the people who'd been there in the previous 4 or 5 years. And the Secretariat came to see me afterwards, and it was along the lines of, well, Mr. Mote, you know, you really don't want to worry about that. It's a long time ago. You know, it's embarrassing, and please, just forget it. They wanted me to become a part of the charade. Well, I wasn't prepared to do that, and that's why I'm still rabbiting on about it even to this day. Nothing will happen, but I'm damned if they should be allowed to get away with it scot-free. Very briefly about the Parliament that I belong to. We are a part of the charade. We are there to give an illusion of democratic accountability. We're there to rubber stamp what's already been decided in these committees that I mentioned and by the Commission. And furthermore, if we aren't there to approve or vote, we don't get paid. Quite literally, we don't get paid. So that's why when there's a debate going on, there may be only 20 or 30 people in the chamber, because that's a charade as well, as I mentioned earlier. But when it comes to voting, suddenly the chamber is stuffed full. Because unless you press the electronic buttons when required, yes, no, and maybe, or abstain, you literally do not get paid. So that's why we all turn up. And I have to tell you, you are looking at one of the most highly paid monkeys pressing buttons for bananas you are ever likely to meet. And I think on that cheery note, if I stop, we'll take questions, and afterwards we can talk about the Constitution. Just about.
How's that sound? Better?
Yep.
Before I ask my question, I would comment that there is in fact a very good reason why the Commission, the EU, other than conformity, wished to crack down on betrayal, and that was because it was a very unfair competitive advantage when dealing with the United States of America, the largest market in the world, are easy conversants with both metric and imperial, and could not be tolerated. And I think probably that's a bigger reason as conformity. However, my question is, if you were to put the same question you put to Verhoeven and the 30 or 40 colleagues you were addressing to the House of Commons, what reply do you think you would get there? And just before you answer that, have the Italians ever finally paid up their fine, considering the milk pressure?
Well, the answer to the last question is I don't know, but I doubt it, because there are unpaid fines, and we're trying to get to the bottom of that go back years. I've got questions down to the Commission which they're trying to avoid answering, asking about how many fines, which countries, what were the issues, and what is the status of the liability now. So I'm on the case, but I can't answer that question. As for the House of Commons, I don't think nowadays I'd have got a very much better response. But I think I would have got something rather than nothing. And that really is an important point you raised, because years ago, and I'm talking about sort of pre-1960, the backbenches of the House of Commons were full of people who had had a lifetime's experience, or half a lifetime's experience, doing something else. And they brought that into the Commons, and they were on the backbenches. And the phrase you will recall that was widely quoted at that time, and had been perhaps for generations, you know, I want to put something back in my later years. And it made a good balance of the House. And those people were to be found on both sides of the House. They don't exist today. Unless you're in your 20s and early 30s and on the right list for the right seat, you aren't going to get a career in politics. They are professional politicians, and they come out of academia, they come out of trade unions, out of social services and the like, maybe journalism. Few of them have ever run a business of their own. And that is a huge loss to this country. Nothing to do with the EU. It's a damage that we've done to ourselves. Now, if I could just touch on, you did ask a question about metrication, but let me update you on that. I have been advised ever since I became a member by the British Weights and Measures Association, and I've been kept abreast of what's going on, and I've also asked probably more questions about this issue than anybody else in Britain of the EU. And the situation we've arrived at is this. Verhoeven, about 2-3 weeks ago, finally admitted in a letter to me, in answer to a direct question, that he is now minded not to enforce metrication in this country. Now, that raises a whole raft of issues about a royal pardon for Steve Thorburn, about whether or not those that wish to start selling again in imperial measurements can do so. If so, where are they going to get the dual standard scales, because they're no longer made, not in this country anyway. And Verhoeven has also admitted that he will not enforce metrication on us, which was due to happen at the end of 2009, for exports. He has finally accepted, after all this time, that it would be far too damaging to international trade. And of course, we are the one country of the 27 that depends on global trade as opposed to internal trade within the market. So that's where we are on that. So.
Yeah, I'd like to say something about the royal pardon you're talking about. So I don't know. I think if you accept a royal pardon, it implies that you were guilty of the thing in the first place. And I think actually what they should be going for is for a not guilty. And I think that in fact would show Lord Justice Laws up for what he is, which is a fool who knows very little about English law.
Well, unfortunately, because Steve died as a result of this dreadful case, the only legal remedy, proper legal remedy, is a royal pardon. And it's, I don't want to diminish it at all, because I think it is important on a matter of principle, but it is, at best, it can only now be symbolic. The real point in the longer term is that we can encourage people, and I know that Neil Heron is talking to Tesco's, for example. We can encourage some of the retailers to start reintroducing imperial measurements for their customers that wish to buy in that form.
Yeah, they already do to some extent.
Oh, indeed. And nobody's been prosecuted.
No, they don't sell it in weight.
No, but they represent it.
Well,
they represent the...
Yes. Yes.
But not so.
High-speed market trade certainly is paying, because I was out yesterday and they talk about payment shares for the
Very good. And nobody will get prosecuted now because Verhoeven has undermined the British position, legal position.
Two questions, Ashley. As you are a member of the Parliament, is it beyond happening or changing that the members of the Parliament can take power from the Commission? Because that seems farming to me. And if you could do that, a lot of these wrongs wouldn't be carried on. And the second thing, I seem to remember perhaps 10, 20 years ago, Air France accepted £2 billion, I think, from the French government. I think the EU said that was wrong. But again, I'm quite sure nothing's happened.
Well, that's on my long list of questions about what is the position on fines that have been imposed on member states at various times for various alleged misdemeanors. Yes, is the answer. First of all, let's deal with your first point. The Commission is where the power lies. The Commission can enforce legislation through the Parliament with very, very rare exceptions. There was one, and I was involved in it, and that involved a ports directive to control the management of ports around the coastline. Now, we have more ports than the rest of them put together, and Southampton, one of the biggest, is in my constituency. And I was briefed by them, and they were absolutely appalled at what was being proposed. And the Commission tried to steamroller this legislation through the Parliament. And the attitude is this, and it does work. If the Parliament that's been elected this time round doesn't like it, fine. 5 years' time, it's gone. There'll be another lot. We'll try again then. They have a long view when they have to. You know from what's been going on with the Constitution that they don't understand the meaning of the word no. And in any case, as I was saying earlier, we are there to provide a kind of charade of democratic accountability. We have no powers. We cannot introduce legislation. We cannot repeal it. We have no control over the budgets. We merely rubber stamp them. And the way it's done, again, it's quite extraordinarily arrogant and dismissive, and there's a contempt for the Parliament. For example, last year they came in with about 25 pages of budgets for us to approve. But they took them as block votes, a bit like the trade unions used to do. They'd have a block vote running over several pages, and you'd have things, one I can remember very well. It covered translation services, cleaning services, transportation, and so on and so on and so on. And then there was one item in there which was miscellaneous expenditure, and it was about 2 billion euros. And there was no explanation at all. And of course, the socialists and the Greens and the Liberals and a large chunk of the group that the Tories belong to, they coalesced together to support the Commission because it suits them. And so it went through. I and about 80 odd, and this is the answer to your question, I and about 80 odd others voted against. Every time there is a vote in the Parliament involving something fundamental, there is a hard core of just under 10% of us, about 80, who are there together voting no. Or in the case of a wrecking amendment, which says we throw out this entire proposition, we might rarely vote yes. I have a few times on those sort of amendments. Now, those 80 of us come from right across the political spectrum, oddly enough, and right across the 27 member states. There are Danes, Estonians, Latvians, a couple of Cypriots, Germans even, a few French, the odd Spaniard. It's a very curious mix of people, but it's not big enough ever to make a difference. Sorry, sir, you had a... Ah, okay.
Given that you MEPs have been legally elected, what is the legal position? Because surely, if you have been legally elected and the Commission has appointed themselves, is there a legal point there?
Well, no, the Treaty of Rome says that the member states nominate the commissioners.
But it probably doesn't say that the elected representatives from those countries cannot have a voice, whereas in practice they don't have a voice.
Well, they would argue that we do have a voice, and they would also admit, if you press them, that they don't have to take the slightest bit of notice of anything we say.
But do you think if a campaign was to take place, it would gather a lot of support from many countries, and particularly from the MEPs themselves?
I think I'd rather win the bigger battle first and sod the rest. No, I don't.
One more, 5 more minutes. 4 minutes. Yeah. 4 minutes.
There was, sir.
During a recent television debate for the leadership of the deputy leadership of the New Labour Party, each of the candidates were asked if there was something that they dealt with in cabinet they'd like to repeal or look at again. Peter Hames said that he would like to look at this gold plating of laws or directives that come from the European Commission. The implication being that they're in some way changed from Europe when they're dealt with in this country. Can you expand on that?
Well, that's another version or another way of putting what I was talking about, shared management. You take an example, the paint shop issue. That was one short piece of legislation, which most other countries, I imagine, just passed through their own system and went into their law, their base law, as it stood. In the UK, it was expanded substantially by officials here, civil servants here, who wanted to make sure that it meant what it said. I suppose that's being kind to them. They're trying to be clearer than the legislation itself as it comes from Brussels. Because I have to say an awful lot of the legislation which emerges from the Commission is not clear. A lot of it is very badly worded, and of course it suffers from being translated into different languages. I mean, just take this word competence. The word competence in this country means one thing. The word competence in France, the same word, means power. Totally different meaning. So you've got that as well, confusing the issue. And there are many, many occasions, it happens all the time, when at some point or another, maybe during a debate, maybe on an email afterwards, you'll get a message from the Secretariat saying that this or that piece of legislation or draft legislation is subject to a revision because the translation is incorrect in some language or other. It is frankly, it's a mess, and we shouldn't be a part of it.
To do with this gold plating of legislation, I have heard that in the civil service, individual civil servants just work on a small part, and so perhaps this civil servant doesn't know what his colleague over here is
quite possible
working on the same piece of legislation. So when it's all put together, it's absolutely horrendous. But in fact, the individuals working on it don't actually have an overview of what they're doing.
And it's worse, of course, because the British Parliament has no power to amend it. They rubber stamp it or not. If it's a directive, they have discretion, because a directive, although it sounds more important, in fact is an instruction for the local member state, each member state, to create its own legal base for enforcement. But if it's a regulation, it comes in as it stands, and we cannot change a word.
Just on last point, it makes one wonder whether in the civil service there couldn't be some mechanism for, if you've got ambiguous or badly worded legislation coming through, that it can be put together in such a way that it's going to be unenforceable. Interesting one.
Nice idea. I just want to say a few words briefly about immigration, and in particular about demographics. As you know, we are no longer able to control our borders, and as a result of that, we have seen hundreds of thousands of people coming into this country from all over Eastern Europe and elsewhere, with an absolute right to live and work here and send the money they earn back to their own countries. We also have a huge influx of people from other parts of the world, in particular the Middle East, who have brought a new culture with them and who show very little sign of attempting to become a part of this nation and its way of life. And that is a serious and growing problem. We've seen some of the consequences in the last few days, and I believe that sooner or later, and I fear it will be sooner, the issue of uncontrolled immigration, and in particular the Islamic dimension, will become a huge and potentially dangerous issue in this country. Having said that, let me also, if you like, flip the coin over and mention that it is true of every country in the European Union that not one of us, not one country, is reproducing itself at a level of sustainability. The demographers will tell you that we need 2.1 children per couple or per female. We are not anywhere near it. In this country, it's around 1.6. In Spain, it's down to 1.2. And in other words, you can extend forward 50 odd years, and the majority of people in this country will not be British, because the immigrant population, and in particular the Islamic community have a reproductive rate of something in excess of 3. And it doesn't take an Einstein to figure out what the consequences would be in the next 50 odd years. It has been estimated by one of this country's leading demographers, Professor Richard Lynn, who has written several books on this subject, that it is entirely possible that we will have a Muslim Prime Minister and a Muslim government within the lifetime of children alive today. That is a very serious situation. Now, I haven't got time to go into that. I am, at the moment, assembling a huge amount of material which I'm going to try and turn into a leaflet of sorts. It may turn out to be a small book, but I hope not, on this subject, because I believe it's so important.
Could I raise the issue of the decline in the populations of all the Western nations? Patrick Buchanan wrote a very good book in about 2001 called The Death of the West. And in that he makes this very same point, that the reason that the Western nations, I mean, Italy is down at about 1.3, I think it is. Yeah. The reason that the Western nations are declining in their populations is solely because of abortion. Since 1968, there have been getting on for 7 million preborn children murdered. And that's the way I put it anyway. And there is the reason for the demographic hole in this population, which is being filled by immigrants. That's the government policy. And of course it's part of the wider, I mean, I take the view that this is all the problems that we have with the EU and so forth are as a result of a one world government agenda. And part of that one world government agenda is to mongrelize the Western nations with immigrants in order to keep them down.
Well, it is clearly part of the strategy to reduce national identity. Yes. That's for sure. The other thing about this issue, and I must then move on, is that Turkey, which is a Muslim country, as you know, if Turkey were to be allowed to join the European Union, then Islam would dominate the European Union without qualification in terms of sheer numbers, because of the numbers already here and the numbers that would then bring in. Sorry, Dave, you heard.
I was going to say that I don't think that's entirely right what you said about abortion. Policy is a contributing
7 million.
Well, I think the other half of the equation is that governments have seen it, an industry, the multinational corporations want to get the whole workforce out to work, male and female. And as a result of that, the females have not started reproducing until much later in life and quite often missing the boat altogether. So I think that's another point.
Well, that's a good point, but it doesn't take away from the numbers which are being aborted. I mean, an extreme example. Yeah. Yes. Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Okay. Right.
We stay with the abortion rate in previous years before the Second World War, for example.
It was negligible.
Yeah.
The pro-abortion lobby.
All right.
Move on, please. You're having a discussion amongst yourself. We come here to
finish that discussion afterwards. I just wanted to make a big point about a big issue and then leave it there for the moment. I'm going to spend the rest of my time talking about the new EU constitution, which clearly has enormous importance and will dominate our lives over the next few months, if not indefinitely. In my view, by far the most important single point about this new treaty, as it will be, is the fact that it retains the clause from the previous one that gives the EU the permanent right to seize more powers in the future without any future agreements. That is not only unacceptable, but in this country it has to be illegal, for the one reason that no parliament can bind its successors. So signing a treaty which allows the EU to invent its own laws or extend its powers indefinitely and without consultation or agreement has to be illegal in this country. I said of the original version, and as I'm sure all of you already now appreciate, the new version is not dissimilar from the last. They've discarded things like a formal recognition of the flag and the anthem, and we now have the British government pretending that somehow it's all different. Every other country in the EU is being told it's the same thing by a different name. And I think some of you will have seen the comments made by Mr. Juncker, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, positively suggesting that the Brits should be kept in the dark. And Mrs. Wallström, who is the Swedish commissioner and one of the more happily incompetent commissioners at that, she has said and admitted in a committee meeting which I was present and able to ask questions, she has admitted that it is the same treaty in all material respects. And she's the one responsible for selling it. She also said in my hearing that the word constitution had been dropped specifically to make it more palatable to the Brits. That was the only reason it was removed, so that we might be conned into accepting it. And I said of the original, and I see no reason to change my words at all, that if you look at what this document actually is and what it is intended to achieve, it is not a constitution at all anyway. It is proscriptive rather than enabling. It makes law instead of creating a framework for lawmaking. It offers no checks or balances for a framework for the future of lawmaking. It consolidates power for a system of government by a self-perpetuating bureaucracy, and it puts an elite group of people above the law to be imposed on everybody else. In a nutshell, it turns the member sovereign nations, from being theoretical masters of the House of Brussels into its servants. It totally reverses the relationship between the EU at the centre and the members. Now, I believe that this constitution, treaty, call it what you like, absolutely has to be destroyed. We have to have a referendum at the very least. And some of you may know that the Victorian lawyer, Professor Dicey, told the British people over 100 years ago that they are free to withdraw their consent from Parliament at any time and have the right to use any means to regain control of our sovereignty. That's what he said. The Bill of Rights of 1689 is still the statute law of this country, and its authority was reaffirmed in the House of Lords in November 2001. And the Bill of Rights is based on a concept of permanence and declares that any actions taken against its principles are null and void, and this is the real point, it specifically forbids handing power to foreigners. It's in there, in those terms. We have, and we always have been, a British square peg in a European round hole. And uniquely amongst all the 27 members, we are being asked to change almost every important aspect of our culture, our traditions, and our way of doing things. And I just want to give you a few examples of what I mean. In this country, the state draws power from the people, and the people, and in the EU, the state exists in its own right, and the people answer to it. So it's a complete opposite. In our country, our rights and freedoms are our birthright. In the EU, they are granted and removed by a passing parade of minor bureaucrats and passing politicians with no track record and no integrity and no obligations to us. Article 52 of the Charter of Fundamental Human Rights, which allegedly grants us rights and freedoms. Article 52 gives the EU to withdraw them all if it so chooses, so they're not worth the paper they're written on. And that, if you recall, was the document that Keith Vaz described as being no more important than a copy of the Beano. But that was then, and this is now, and it's been incorporated into the new treaty. Blair came back and said he got an opt-out, but it's a footnote, and European Union lawyers have already said that if it was put to a test in the European Court of Human Rights, or the European Court generally, because there are two separate legal processes here, neither of them would sustain the claim that Blair made that he'd got an opt-out. It wouldn't stand up in law. In the UK, everything is permitted until our elected Parliament decides otherwise. In the EU, as in many member states there, everything is implicitly forbidden until the state decides to allow it. Here, our market economy is based on free enterprise. In the EU, it's governed by social factors. Here we have common law safeguards like habeas corpus, trial by jury, the presumption of innocence, double jeopardy, all of which are now being eroded, of course. But European criminal law has no such safeguards to start with against oppression from the state. And here we can throw out a government we don't like, but in the EU that is much more difficult to do, and it leaves the professional bureaucrats largely untouched, even if you do change the Parliament, which we were talking about earlier. And here, crucially, we tend to uphold and respect the rule of law, at least in part because we can change it at any time. Our Parliament has the right, absolutely, to repeal anything any previous government has passed. Now, in the EU, there is much less respect for the law because it is almost impossible to change. And that's why so many countries tend to ignore EU legislation they don't like. Here, the police exist to uphold the law, and the armed forces are here to defend the realm. In the EU, they both exist as arms of the state. And here we don't tolerate fraud and corruption in public office, or anywhere else for that matter. And in the EU, it is endemic and regarded as a part of the system. Now, Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, who was the principal author of the original brief, said that he wanted to create a vehicle, and it was included in the drafts of the early drafts, quote, to make the EU more democratic, more transparent, and more efficient, unquote. The final version that went to a vote in France and Holland did not mention any of those objectives. They were removed in the final version, completely disappeared. Now I have to tell you, and I'm referring back to the meeting that I was at recently when Mrs. Wallström was present, the Commission is again using those words as a means of selling the idea, but I have a £5 note at least that says that when we come to the final version of the treaty, they will disappear again as well. Curiously enough, the final version last time talked vaguely about, quotes, bringing the people closer to the union, unquote. And it also talked about, quotes, creating a model of the new world order, quotes off. Where have we heard that before? Now, I think this draft constitution, as the last one, has done us a great service because it has crystallized the issue between us and them. This is an attempt to turn a Europe of nations into a nation called Europe. And it forces us to decide if we want Europeans to become our masters. And I had the opportunity of speaking in the so-called debate on this issue in the Parliament recently, and I used these very words. You are our neighbours, you should be our friends, you cannot be our masters. And you can imagine how well that went down. I would like to ask you, what should we make, what can you make of Angela Merkel's statement when she claimed that the new version of the treaty should have a new name, for the reasons I've explained, to make it more palatable to us, and then she went on to say, quote, we must use different terminology without changing the legal substance, unquote. And I told the House when I had the opportunity how reassured I was to be so vividly reminded of German commitment to democracy and the rule of law. Whenever, I ask you, whenever before did a sovereign nation permit outsiders to impose a new constitution on them except after defeat in war? Doesn't happen. And the reality is that the EU was and always will be, because of its structure, a 1950s solution to the problems of the 1920s and 30s. But today is a different world. We live in a high-tech, fast-moving, flexible, unpredictable world. And we need a form of imaginative, responsive, minimalist government to allow us to respond to today's world. And that absolutely is not what we have from Brussels. I've told them, and again it went down like a lead balloon, that the EU and its grandiose ideas are now a part of the problem. It is no longer a part of the solution, and probably never was. And they also don't like to be reminded of two crucial things. First of all, this new treaty says, and Mrs. Wallström confirmed it in public at that meeting, that all 27 member states have to ratify it for it to become law. All 27. Last time, those of you that read the small detail will remember that there was an option that if, I think it was up to 6 states did not, it could still become law. They hadn't bargained for the problem that you have 2 of the original core members, 2 of the 6, saying no. And that changed the rules. It was never included in the treaty, but reality kicked in and they said, well, we've got to rethink. And they've had 2 years of reflection. But what about the 27 member states? There is hostility to be found in every single one of them. You may remember that Luxembourg was one of the countries that voted yes last time round. People forget, however, that the vote no in Luxembourg was 43%. And we all know what happened in France and Holland. And looking around the Parliament today and talking to the members there, there is intense opposition in Poland, in the Czech Republic, in Austria, in Latvia, in parts of Scandinavia, and of course here. Now in Poland we've got these twin brothers who are causing all sorts of ructions, and they have a huge following. And I think the chances of Poland ratifying this are close to nil.
Unless they get bribed enough.
Well, our money will change hands, be sure of it. Why do you think Mr. Blair's hung on to the very end?
Well, we all knew why.
Yes. But let me tell you about the Czech Republic, because this is good news. One of my colleagues there, who's a very down-to-earth former businessman, Czech, speaks very good English, and he's become quite a friend. And he told me something I did not know, and I don't think is widely understood. In the Czech Republic, for them to ratify, both houses, an upper chamber and a lower, have to ratify it separately. And he said there is such an intense opposition in the upper chamber in the Czech Republic that he is quite certain it will fail. So there's two already, Poland and the Czech Republic. There's a nice irony about Poland, because I seem to recall in 1939 we went to their help. This time they may be coming to ours. In Austria, the last Eurobarometer of support, Austria took last place from us. We've been bottom for years. And it's quite offensive to find us being ousted from bottom place. They're now at 29%, and we're at 33%. And in Latvia, they're at 31%. We're not even second last now, we're third last. So there's a lot of scepticism. And then we come to the referenda that are obligatory. In Ireland and in Denmark, there is an obligation for a national referendum, because their constitutions require a referendum if their constitution is about to be amended, which this clearly would do. So there's a real problem for those two countries, and it's widely rumoured or expected that Sweden will do the same because of the enormity of the change which is being proposed. Our government, of course, is trying to pretend that it's all different and we don't need a vote. But they'll see, and I believe that we will eventually force Gordon Brown to do something, even if it's to go back to Brussels and start renegotiating. Now, the real problem, I think, is the scale of what is proposed. And I want to use, have any of you seen, where are they? Eurofacts for the 6th of July, a couple of days ago, that version. Have you got it? There's a very, very good summary on page 3 of the individual items that are going to damage this country as a direct result from what we know, of what we know. And I won't go through it because I think most of you have got it, or you can probably get hold of a copy. Oh, do I? Oh, all right. I have the only one, it seems. Well, in the kingdom of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. Well, let me just run through it. The status of the mandate. Exclusive framework for forthcoming intergovernmental conference. What that means is that they've reversed the whole process. Last time we had a international intergovernmental conference which led to a treaty. This time they've drafted a treaty which now has to be put to an intergovernmental conference. So when Mr. Blair says, I've signed up, and Mr. Brown is obliged to go along with it, that, in polite parlance, is rubbish. Because it's the wrong way around. he has every right to go to the Intergovernmental Conference, which will agree the text of the treaty, which this last meeting didn't. All it agreed was the principles, and he has every right, therefore, to renegotiate. And that, I'm sure, is what will happen. And even if it isn't Brown's objective to renegotiate, I'm quite sure in other countries, like some of the ones I've been talking about, particularly Poland, they will. The European president will be an individual rather than a country, and will hold the presidency for 2.5 years. What it doesn't say in here, but it could have done, is that that same individual could also be the president of the Commission, and he could hold the office of the chairman of the Internal Security Committee. So we have the situation, and you can't structure a situation like that by chance. It must be deliberate. And what it means is that one person could hold all 3 positions of the greatest power simultaneously, and nothing and nobody could stop them. Precisely. Well, we don't know. But the point is, they have structured a power base for one person, which, if the wrong person got in it, would reproduce a tyranny of the kind that we've seen over the last 100 years.
Antichrist scenario.
Foreign affairs. Let me just go through this. Foreign affairs. We lose the power to make our own foreign affairs policy. It's couched in such weasel terms that it doesn't quite sound like that. But in reality, there is one man who will speak for all 27 nations in terms of foreign policy and its implementation. So it is a profound change. Just as we've lost our seat at the World Trade Organization, you can see that the logic of this then leads to the demand that the EU wants our seat on the Security Council. Entirely predictable. And so it goes on. The voting, the number of votes required and the amount of blocking votes required inside the process of agreeing on new legislation is reduced for each member state, particularly for us. The EU takes on a legal personality of its own. That means it can sign treaties on our behalf, whether we like them or not. There would be a European public prosecutor, which means the further erosion of our common law, criminal law, and the introduction of corpus juris in this country. Charter of Fundamental Human Rights I've touched on already. And then we have this business about competition. The French, you may recall, during the negotiations, wanted the phrase about free and undistorted competition removed from the treaty because they don't believe in free enterprise, they believe in a market, a social market as they call it. And Mr. Blair gave way on that as well. And that could have huge implications for things like the Working Time Directive, health and safety, and so on and so on. And so it goes on. Oh yes, and now we come to your point, sir. They are gracious enough to include a clause which would allow a country to apply to leave the European Union. The nerve of it. I mean, can you really imagine us, Brits, going to Brussels and saying, please, sir, can we leave? I mean, who are they kidding?
But they're not kidding, are they?
No, well, let me just come to this. We can leave tomorrow. All we need is 331 votes in the House of Commons to repeal the 1972 Act that took us in. The problem we have is that there aren't 331 votes to be had as the House of Commons is currently structured. And unfortunately, there is no real prospect of that happening even at the next election. I think, and this is only my opinion, it is much more likely that the EU is going to collapse. I think we will leave. I can't tell you when, I've no idea, but I do think that the seeds of its own destruction are in there and they're well embedded. And I also believe that a lot of members of the Commission and the staff truly fear that outcome. There is quite a lot of evidence to show that they are worried, profoundly worried about where they are and where they're going. And I've been trying with my colleagues to find ways of encouraging that process. I think this is one. The Constitution, if it founders again, will produce a huge negative backlash internally. Huge. Therefore, we have to destroy it. And the other thing, hold on one second. The other thing which I think is profoundly on our side is the state of affairs of the euro. Now, we don't hear much about it in this country, not in terms of economics anyway. But the euro is a huge problem in many member states that are using it. You may already know that in Germany, in Italy, in parts of southern France and elsewhere, there are now ersatz, local currencies in circulation in small areas because people are fed up with the euro and its effects. It has had a huge negative impact in terms of inflation. And you've got serious crises. In Ireland, you've got property prices going through the roof because the interest rates there are so low. And in Germany, you've got unemployment at over 12% because the interest rate is too high. And these cracks keep appearing. If you go onto my website, you will see some of the information and some of the questions I've been asking about the euro and the problems that it's creating. As it stands at the moment, it is not a long-term prospect. And that too seems to me to be a potential source of catastrophic destruction at some point and to be encouraged. Right, that's me. So,
I think that it will collapse on its own at some stage. But the problem with what's happening at the moment is they are going to end up controlling our forces, including our nuclear deterrent, and they're going to end up controlling every nuclear deterrent from everywhere in there. And what happens when countries like this collapse or are on the verge of collapsing is what happened in Argentina when they went into the Falklands. They lash out. And the only people they could conceivably lash out with all these nuclear weapons is the United States. And that is a seriously, seriously dangerous situation. So we don't actually want them to fall flat on their faces, because that way we don't get nuked.
Bill.
Might they ask us to leave because this guard is hinting at it?
Oh yes. Oh yes. There was a wonderful incident in Estonia where I went with a delegation from the Constitutional Affairs Committee during the debate on the first constitution before it got rejected. And I was the only one of 5 delegates who was against. And the chairman of our group was a German called Joe Leinen, who's actually quite a nice guy, except he's a federalist to his bootstraps. And there we were in the Estonian Parliament at their invitation to talk about the new constitution. And Joe was foolish enough to give me the floor. And I said, I couldn't resist it. I said, well, ladies and gentlemen, I'd just like to remind you, this was just after the French vote. I'd just like to remind you of a remark made by Mr. Chirac not long ago, who said that any country that rejects this constitution will have to leave the European Union. And when this meeting had finished, the press were there, all the media were there, the Baltic Times and all the rest. After this meeting was finished, I had them all round me, all wanting me to repeat this phrase, and I dominated the local papers the next day, and everybody was furious. So, but you're right. It is a prospect, put it like that. Sir, David.
You made a very good speech, I think, discussion on, particularly on the Constitution. I like the wording. Obviously, you've got that prepared.
From?
The speech, the talk you've given on the Constitution.
Yes, yes.
Is it possible that you could put that out on the internet?
Right. There is a short version on my website on video, and it's called Who Governs Britain? And it lasts about 4 minutes. You can go onto my website and you scroll down the videos, and there it is. If anybody would like the long version, which is sort of 20 minutes, 30 minutes, I did have it recorded, not by Fern, but it was recorded during the first round on this constitutional issue. So we're talking about 2 or 3 years ago. And quite honestly, not a word needs changing. And that too is called Who Governs Britain? And if you want to buy a copy, you can do so again via my website.
Philip Foster's also done rather a good little booklet, which
Philip
Foster, Reverend Philip Foster.
Oh yes.
Which has on the left-hand side of the page items from the Constitution, and on the right-hand side his answers to it, which is quite a nice little small booklet.
Right, there's a question over here.
There's Brian.
There's lots.
Okay, well.
Sorry, sir. What I wanted to say, it seems to me that the polls make such an impact.
It seems to me that the polls have made such an impact because they have dared to tell the truth, that what the European Union is a vicious resurgence of a fascist or a communist, whatever you want to call it, regime. And that is what the Polish president was prepared to say. What is coming is what we've seen before.
Yeah.
And I would suggest, if I may, that the reason that he has had such an impact and the reason that the Czechs are saying we want out is because they know what is coming. In this country, still, we talk about the European Union as if it was some sort of idiotic game. And if we use the words and we tell people that what is coming is a vicious state, a vicious police state, people wake up. And I would just encourage you, in your talks and in your written work, to tell people what this European Union really is. That's really the first thing. The second one is, you started talking about the hollowing out of UK. The hollowing out of UK is now nearly so bad that it doesn't matter what the EU does or doesn't do, they already control this country.
Mm-hmm.
NHS, schools, police, military, we can show it. Councils, utilities, it has been hollowed out to such an extent that we are on a knife edge. And therefore, what we need to do to get out is not to wait for the EU to collapse. If it happens, it's a bonus. We need to start telling people what the EU really is. And I'd say it in the nicest way, but still, we are not hearing people call the beast by its real name. It is vicious, it is backed by the sorts of brains that put the Soviet Union together, or the Third Reich. These people are killers. They don't care who they bribe, browbeat, or put in prison. They are not playing a game. It's war. And we need to start talking in those terms. I'm sorry.
Iran may well be right, but as Daniel Hannan pointed out only the other day, if you tell people what it really was, they don't believe you.
On the contrary, sir, they do.
Daniel now says he has to tone down what he says about the EU to be believed.
Well,
you might not comment on that.
Well, I have to say, I don't always agree with Daniel, but I do on this. I mean, I am frequently accused of going too far. The implication from my left is that I haven't gone far enough.
By who? Who says you go too far?
The media. Yeah, well, that's precisely the point. That's precisely the point. If you start making statements of this kind, right though they may be, you are in effect seen off the premises. You are ignored. I have been trying very hard to be as blunt and as clear about what I think and why as I could be. But I'm always conscious that apart from people who are totally committed, as it would appear most people in this room are, when you're talking to average person in the street or trying to get through the newspapers to them, it is extremely difficult to convey on this scale. I'm not saying it's not tried, I am saying that we are up against a huge obstacle, and it's called a media that is not prepared to listen.
No, it's a media that's controlled.
Well, that too, of course. Yeah.
Ashley, can I follow on Brian's remarks and your own remarks and suggest a little sample for people to see? The Emperor's suit of clothes.
Can you speak up?
The Emperor's suit of clothes combined with the Wizard of Oz run by the mafia. It could be said, or has been said, that's the be-all, the end-all, everything about Europe. I've got a second point I'd like to a question to ask you, but your comments on that.
Well, that rather assumes you're talking to somebody who's been through a schooling system and has some understanding of the subtlety of the remark. And these days, we've got tens of thousands of young people on the streets who have not properly been educated. We've also got 2 generations of people, including now David Cameron and his like, who have no idea what it is like for this country to govern itself. They weren't old enough to know. They regard the EU as the norm, and that is a real problem. We are, most of us, are old enough to remember, but they don't. They've never seen it. They are fearful of it, I suspect. And I've made this point on other occasions. I think we're up against a level of anxiety amongst the younger generation who simply have no grasp of what it would take and what the opportunities would be once we restore our right to govern ourselves.
The younger generation, the question of pockets, could you comment on whether there's much more opposition amongst your fellow MEPs regarding the Galileo project, which seems to be balmy and costs spiralling out of control, the European satellite?
Can I refer you to my website? I've dealt with that on there at length.
I would agree totally with Ashley over the question of exposing all these theories. I mean, the thing that worries me is we've got so many conspiracy theories about the EU, ranging from the papacy being the root cause of it, communism being the root cause of it, Germans being the root cause of it, the bishops of the Church of England. But no one believes us. We've got to get down to the fundamental. I happen to believe that at its root cause we should be telling the public what interests them, how it affects their pocket.
No, that's not right. There is no such thing as conspiracy theory. There's only theories of conspiracy.
I think one of the most important things addressed.
Speak up, Keith.
One of the most important things that have been addressed is the question of the fundamental question of immigration and its effect on this country, because as you say, in 50 years' time, we'll be, the British will be the minority in their own country. Now the point is, unless we have a national identity and preserve it, there's no point in coming out of the EU. I mean, is there? No. The other thing I have to say is that over the course since 1997, Blair has made 1 million people into British citizens. Now nobody, I don't believe that anybody who went to the polls in 1997 were voting for these people to become British citizens. So under what rights has he got to do this?
The people also
citizenship
voted
to
for
1 million
referendum,
people.
but we're not getting it.
Well, Mr. Blair was not noted for observing the rule of law, and I'm certainly not going to explain what I regard as a disgraceful piece of lawlessness in that particular instance. But he was also constrained by the fact that under the terms of the Maastricht Treaty, which he did not sign, he inherited the consequences, we gave away our right to control our own borders. And the inevitable consequence has been that we've got huge numbers of people who've come here ever since 1992, accelerated rapidly from 97 onwards. And of course, amongst those many hundreds of thousands of people, there are people who have then chosen to become British citizens.
Why do we let them? I mean, we don't have control of the borders, but should we have control of who's become British citizens?
Well, of course we should, but we don't. We have a government that chooses not to.
All right, Bill. Okay. Again.
The trouble is, as all of us, we here are not typical of the mass of voters out there. We've all taken the trouble to understand what it's about. We all know what it's about. We don't need convincing. But out there, they've been told by every single politician of every party that it is a good thing. Well, you can't blame them if they don't perhaps trust the politicians they've elected rather than us. This is our problem. And I mean, to give you an example, when the last discard constitution was at its height, the Conservatives decided to get a parliamentary petition together for a referendum. It actually was very effective. I was a party chairman at the time, and I used a beagle meet as an opportunity to raise signatures. And I asked the young whips if they would sign. And they said, I've no idea what you're talking about, but because I trust you, I'll sign. They didn't even know that Giscard's constitution existed. And these were intelligent young people, but they just want to get on with their lives and leave politics to politicians. This is what we're up against. So it's no good saying, tell them the truth. They haven't got to base one.
Thank you, Bill. Okay, David.
Well, I think the answer to that one is to give up, well, not give up, but
Yes.
de-emphasise, try and get the ordinary person in the street to understand what we know and how we think. I think it's now a question of interacting, people like us interacting with the authorities. As Brian has said, the time now is to go into the police stations, as this gentleman here has done, and lay charges against people. If enough people do it, it's going, even if you don't succeed in getting criminal
Is there a question in those two?
what you do is at least you start to get an understanding. You get publicity in the press and you start to get the message around that way. What's up?
It's done with the magistrates.
I will have to come to an end.
Having been negative, could I now be positive? I think what we've got to do is concentrate on one or two issues that we can get to. I think the illegality of paying our taxes to the EU is something that they could understand because it's a corrupt organisation that doesn't keep proper books of accounts. I think there are other simple issues like that. The fishing at one time was very understandable. So I think we've got to target a few issues that will resonate with the great populace. But we've got to be terribly careful, and I don't think actually particularly want to hang on like leaving the EU, because that frightens them. If we could target on something like the payments, they'll trap us out anyway, because they don't want it, they don't want it.
If you want to know the scale of the problem in terms of communication, just go and stand outside Chelsea football ground on a Saturday afternoon and look at the tens of thousands of young people going to watch and ask yourself, how on earth do we communicate with them? That's the scale of the problem.
Tell them the truth.
I'm afraid Edward Heath was right.
One more
There are
question.
a bunch of morons.
I'd like to endorse what Brian said earlier on. Basically, you've got to get the people at the top thinking together. Now, you mentioned, I'm not sure if Czech or Slovakia, they are
Czech
thinking
Republic.
negatively about the European market. Ireland, who's never been a total good friend of us, but at least speak the same language most of the time. Why not get those people together? You're an MP for Europe. You've got a platform you can come from. And either go out to visit these people and talk to them and come back and tell us what they think, and then we stand together. Because I can remember from my parents, Churchill was the scum of the earth back in the mid-30s. He wasn't thought of it by the so-called majority of people. They're all a warmonger. He was an anti-this and anti-that, until the time came they realised up to here was the problem. Then they got together. But somebody got up and said it then. And eventually, when the truth dawned on them, the whole thing came together. But unless you get top people working together, you're not going to, you've got a lot of sheep running around, bowing around, and not doing anything. Somehow or other, you've got to bring it in together as a nucleus, and you've got one in the east and one in the west there. I just suggested maybe others you know about that will start to splinter them up and start worrying. They don't know where the next problems are coming from. If we just sit up there and say, well, we don't like this, we don't like that, but if 3 or 4 people say it under one roof, I think you'll find that the others will start coming together.
Thank you.
That's all I think. I mean,
Okay.
I think that's it. I call on Harry now to give a vote of thanks for it. Thank you very much.
Well, I've been dying to make my speech, but been refrained from doing so. I did promise you, if you remember, at the beginning, that this was a peak performance. I think you'll agree that's what we've had today. I don't remember a better. And not only have we made Ashley welcome, but I think we need him again and again and again. So, giving you this small token, dear Ashley, I hope this means that you will come back again and hope for more.
That's what French mean.